Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Hospitality Association webinar this month. We'll be talking about 10 factors impacting the hospitality business value at the time of the sale. And with me today, and rejoined, by the way, thank you, Oliver, but is Oliver Kotelnikov of
Morning.
He's with IBA. We always appreciate having Oliver around because his experience in the restaurant industry is a part of what makes him a favorite here at the association. So he's a leading broker at IBA in the hospitality sector of the Pacific Northwest perimeter. So he's from our area. They're a full service business brokerage. Their offices they have offices in Bellevue and Spokane and Portland. And IBA has represented owners of regional hospitality businesses in the sale of the company since 1975, with over 4,200 successfully completed transactions. And just a little bit about Oliver here. He spent over 25 years in the trenches on the front line of restaurant industry as an owner and operator of Piroshki Bakery, growing the family business to 5 locations and over 60 employees. So it's always nice to have a brother operator or sister operator, but a brother operator in this case. Oliver, thank you for joining us. I greatly appreciate you being here to cover this topic. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. So on the topic of what's impacting the hospitality business value here, the format here will be a Q&A session. Oliver will give an in-depth review of each topic. I have 10 topics I want to touch bases on here that are important. He'll rate these 1 to 10 by the order of importance in successfully completing the sale of a business, of your restaurant or hotel, etc. So, if you have questions, by the way, just put them in the chat. There's a Q&A section. I'll watch both of those so you can pick them up there. With that, Oliver, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So the first topic is always kind of to me, one of the best ones to get started with: profitability.
Sure. Yeah, and that's why we get into business, right? Is to turn a profit, and as we'll find out, there are many other factors, but profitability is important, and it's the key factor, I would say, driving valuations. So I'm just going to give it a 9 out of 10, and keeping in mind that there are different kinds of profitability, and sort of how do we arrive at the number. But somebody looking at a business is going to be pretty closely looking at what can they generate, and how much of their effort does it involve to turn that particular amount of profit. And there's competition, and so where else could they find something like that? And the factors involved in in making a living, because typically owner-operated hospitality opportunities, this is their lifestyle businesses, and people get into them for a certain lifestyle and to make a living. So and all of that starts with profitability. So 9 out of 10 on profitability.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the most important ones. I know I have a question here on profitability. I think I got to dig it out here. So I'll come back to that. Next one is just quality of books and records, right? Getting prepared.
Sure, and it ties right into profitability. So when we're selling a privately owned company, and we're on the market, and we're claiming a certain revenue, gross revenue, whether that's top line revenue or profitability, we need to be able to substantiate it and back it up. So somebody looking at the books and records, how clear is it? In terms of financials, it's really the cleaner and the simpler, the better. So the less that's sort of more or less apparent at a glance, the better, and less of a complicated story that's attached to the financials and narrative to untangle, the cleaner, the better they are. So it ties closely into profitability, and it's a way of justifying and substantiating that number. So I'm gonna I will say that it will be also 9 out of 10 because it's part B of profitability.
So I think the setup of that, I mean, one of the things we've talked about in the past is making sure we're thinking ahead of the sale, right?
Sure.
And making sure that an area, especially in the quality of books and records, is, I mean, you've really take a hard look at those 90 days prior to really before you get into it. Is that kind of a reasonable summary there?
You know, I would say in evaluating a business, we look at 48 to 60 months of historical financials. So, you know, we're going back to determine what the business has done historically, and we're projecting current financials and really into the future, because that's what the new owner is buying. You know, to put a dent into financials, you really want to get started a little bit earlier than 90 days, because if we look at it 90 days prior and we say we need to do something about cost of goods or cost of labor or maintenance expenses, it takes a little while to implement those measures.
Right.
So I would say, you know, if you're considering exiting and your exit strategy options, I would start as early as if you're thinking you're exiting in 24 to 36 months, start now. Let's do an evaluation, and then we can look at what's impacting value and what can be changed, and make recommendations on quality of books and records. You know, if there is a narrative, and back to profitability, if maybe it's underperforming, or if it's, you know, hitting it out of the park for the first year, you know, we need to have an explanation as to why the variance is occurring and what is causing the fluctuations, whether it's positive or negative.
Okay. All right. And I'm going to throw in here at some point what a business is worth. I know that's always a tough question, and a lot of questions come up about that. But let me move on first to a couple of other areas.
Sure.
So obviously 90 days out of making sure everything's in order is not the case. You want to be 12, 18 months out. If, like you said, you're looking at it now, you've got to get ahead of the game.
I would say 12 to 18 months is a good metric. Yeah.
Okay. All right. How about operational infrastructure, employees, systems, manuals, company culture, you know, the operational aspect?
Sure. And, you know, a buyer coming in is going to look at the opportunity and see, you know, there's a risk associated with the transition of ownership. And so how clear is it to replicate the day-to-day business and to replicate what the previous owner has done? So without, you know, having it be verbal, if there are systems, manuals, protocols, they can look at it and they understand how, you know, if we're presenting 4 years of historical financials, well, how does it break down? What happens in the course of a month? What happens in the course of a week? What happens, and then further and further, you know, what happens during the one isolated day of business, and how does the business really run? So the operational infrastructure is what really determines the ability of the business to continue running smoothly. And it also suggests to the owner what their role in the business is, because if the day-to-day operations are taken care of, and there are manuals and protocols for all those, you know, types of daily aspects, then they can come in and say, okay, well, I'm going to come and grow the business. I have the opportunity to be a business owner versus an employee in my own business, because those systems are so strong.
Right, right. Hey, I noticed Andrea Lines joined us, and she has got very similar.
Hi, Andrea.
Yeah. I expect good questions from you, Andrea.
Yeah.
She a lot of experience in this area, gets a lot of good questions, so she'll come up with some really good questions as well.
Andrea is also, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Andrea is an associate broker with IBA in the hospitality transactional division, and is in the audience and can field questions as they come up. I'll say hello again to Andrea, and Andrea can maybe say hi in the chat if she's hearing us. So.
How about the role of ownership? How about that aspect of it being one of the 10 factors?
Yeah, nice, good segue into the operational infrastructure. And so what is the role of ownership? And, coming into a business, it may be that the owner is involved in the day-to-day operations, and that may be what the new buyer wants. The more flexibility there is for the owner to choose what the role is, and typically that, the preferred role is executive management and scaling and growing the business, with sort of optional participation in the day-to-day on a discretionary basis. But if we go back to profitability, let's say a business is generating $150,000 a year in profit. If we have two owners who are working 60 hours a week each, that number represents one thing. If it's one owner who is managing the business on an executive level and perhaps growing on opening new locations or improving systems, that is a different, that casts the profitability in a different light. So we must absolutely in the business consider what is the owner having to do for that profitability and what their role is in the business, and that will attract a different kind of buyer, and it will appeal to different sort of market demographics in that sense.
And in an independent scenario, maybe that owner also, the current owner helping that transfer of business during that time period can be.
Yeah, so transition training is where that comes in, and great question. And so how easy is it to replace the owner? So if the role of the owner, if the proverbial 5 a.m. phone call that initiates with every hospitality business about the walk-in refrigerator being down, where does that go? If it goes to the owner's personal cell phone, that's one role. If there's an operational manager and maybe the owner is somewhat removed from those and is able to focus on other things, that is a different role of ownership. And a new owner coming in, he's going to see, try to determine how many bases does he have to cover, and how much of it is really transferable. So there's also the owner goodwill aspect. If the owner is the link to customer relationships, to vendor relationships, if there's a long-standing personal relationship, we need to be able to transfer that. So really, the less of a bottleneck that the owner is in their own business, the better. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, because as owners, we want to feel like really substantive, meaningful pieces, foundational components of our business. But at the time of sale, it can be a detriment if the role of the owner is, if it's just omnipresence and nothing works without him or her, it can be difficult.
Well, and it could take longer to obviously make that transfer. Let's jump up back to profitability for a second.
Sure.
A couple of questions have come up, and let me start here. One from Rob. When you say profit in an owner operator business, should that include both the owner's salary and the into the remaining net operating profit?
Yeah. So, and great question. And it if we're talking about revenue multiples, the multiple of revenue, whatever it is for a particular business, will not apply to the portion that's ownership's labor, if that makes sense. We need to factor out what the owner does, and so what is the clean net operating profit after that, and that is the portion that gets the revenue multiple. Because the labor portion, every business is divided into a business and a job. And a buyer will not want to pay a multiple for the job portion of the business. They will pay an amount for it, but there isn't a premium added to that. So we do need to factor out ownership's contribution to the labor of the business if we're talking about multiples. I hope that answers it.
Well, let's find out. Rob, if you got additional backup to that, just type it in and I'll make sure I pick it up. One of the things is value that comes along, and I don't mean to get stuck on profitability, because I think we got some real good areas yet to talk about that help the overall value of business, right? So but I think someone's eating away at this question as well. And it's always about that multiple, right?
Mhm.
So, I own a boutique hotel, or I own a specialty restaurant, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
although I'm not looking to sell in the short term, what's the business worth? Is there a multiplier of their net operating income or EBITDA, right? Other than the rule of thumb that, that they could use to get best guess of what is that rule of thumb, to kind of get that idea of what the value is. Now with that, and I know there's a lot of factors, easy to say, right? There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be a factor. That's the first thing that'll come up. But let's say I don't own my property and this one, right? I just own the business, but I got a long lease. I got 17, 15, 17 years lease,
Yeah.
right? So plenty of time to work that out, but I got a successful business. Is there any way to come up with kind of a rule of thumb for what the value multiplier might be?
Yeah, so it's going to come down to industry. It will come down to the operational model. It's going to come down to risk also. So if it's a single location, single point store, and there's one stream of revenue, which is retail, let's say clients walking in the door, that's going to be a lower multiple, because it's a riskier, even though you have 17 years, we're depending on, let's say it makes, around numbers, $1 million a year. Each one of those dollars is dependent on somebody making a decision to walk into the door and hand those dollars over. If this is a business that also, let's say, does wholesale, they do catering, and they do online sales, that's a diversified revenue stream that diversifies the risk. So if one of those streams fails, like retail, for instance, over the last couple of years struggled, then there's a way to turn that around and make that up elsewhere. Rule of thumb, and I know that this is a big question, for a single point hospitality store, I'm going to put that multiple between 2 and 3 without looking at the documents, and with ownership's labor counted out of that. So if you're looking at your net operating income, but you're working 80 hours a week, we need to determine what that labor replacement cost of the owner is worth, and how much is the business generating to the owner as a business for owning the business versus for working in their business.
And then I would say that's kind of then the value could potentially go up if that's brand name, been around, recognized, maybe even have a second or third location. I know you were talking about single location.
Absolutely. Yeah. Multiple locations, different revenue streams. If we're saying 17 years, but so if it's a single location and single revenue stream, how safe is that income over the next 17 years?
Right.
There are lots of factors that sort of threaten it, right? So, and if we're diversifying that risk, that makes the marketplace feel better, and when the marketplace feels better, they increase the multiple. That's the simple way to look at it.
I want to come back and ask you towards the end how you maximize that. Okay. And I think I know these 10 factors is a combination of that. So I want to summarize that at the end, but let me ask the next area. The way the business looks, curb appeal, the online footprint, today it becomes a big factor, right?
Sure.
Customer reviews, public records. Can you make some comments in that area?
Yeah, so when we're looking at these factors, they're all important, and let's say we're looking at 10, but we're really looking at at this on the basis of the 80-20 principle. So which inputs generate the largest returns, and so curb appeal, online presence. If somebody's looking at buying your business, the first thing they're going to do is drive by it, go in, and before they do that, they'll go online. They'll look at pictures, they'll read the reviews. And so, we all know about first impressions, and it's hard to change those. So, a lot of bang for your buck as an owner is to claim your reviews, respond to them, even if they're negative. We know the land of reviews, the review landia is a tough space, but if you're engaged and you're answering, there's a value add there. As far as curb appeal, somebody looking by it, as an owner, they're picturing themselves running it, driving up to it, walking inside. how it looks, all of that, it has a big impact. So, to some degree, if you're wanting to invest money, repainting, changing the menu board, having a nice sign up front, having the landscaping taken care of will, in that regard, produce a bigger return than replacing the roof or because both valuable, but curb appeal, quick fix, not necessarily quick, but something that you can complete from A to B in a reasonable time frame and for a reasonable amount of money. That's probably the biggest return for your dollar in preparation to go to market.
And great photos online, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
professional
Yeah.
photos. So operationally, when you're 18 months out, right, you're thinking of, what's your timeline to make an impact. You obviously don't want to make this, a shoot from the hip decision. I'm going to sell tomorrow, right?
Mhm.
You got to think about that ahead of time. How you're operating, cleanliness, your operations, like you
Yeah.
said, dealing with reviews, public records. I mean, anything to keep that thing clean and spotless and looking good is a very important aspect, because it'll also attract multiple offers potentially as well.
It will increase the interest, absolutely. And it's
Right.
also something that's probably one of the factors that's the most within the owner's control. So, books and records, you have the books and records, but do most owners know exactly what's impacting value and how to change it? No, they need to recruit a business broker, somebody like me. We need to get in touch with a tax professional. We need to work on that together. As far as changing things in your business, on your business website, appeal, that's something that a business owner can do themselves, parallel to some of these other factors that we're addressing. So it's really a multi-pronged approach, because we want it to look and appear presentable on all levels, because somebody's doing that level of due diligence when they're purchasing a business. They're looking at everything.
All right, let's move on. Let's talk about seller-owned real estate.
Sure. Yeah. Seller-owned real estate. Again, we're putting numbers on it. I would say that with real estate being involved, it attracts a larger number of buyers, because it collateralizes the investment. It's more of a long-term approach, and it attracts typically a stronger, perhaps better funded buyer, because there's it's a larger purchase when we're talking about a business and commercial real estate. And we do a number of these transactions and find lots of quality buyers when real estate is involved. I would say on the attractive scale, 1 to 10, I'm going to put that at an 8. I think that escalates and kind of puts that opportunity into an upper echelon when real estate is involved, because it's paying rent versus paying yourself, right? And so the business will always pay a fair market occupancy cost, even if it's into a seller-owned real estate holding entity, but it is a more substantial investment, and you are in control of costs a lot more as a business owner when you do have the real estate to fall back on as your own.
Okay. Yeah, it's it always helps, obviously. You don't always have it, but if you have it, it's obviously gonna bring the value up, because you can control your business, right? How about equipment, facilities, leaseholds, and improvements? One of the things that come up in my mind is that, you've got this value that you want to make sure you have good value over the next 18 months, get the maximum amount of, but you might also have some investment you got to do in your business. Right?
Sure.
Equipment, keeping on top of it, not just the little repairs, but how much of that do I do? And, is it a one-time investment? I mean, I know that's kind of mixing maybe, or apples and oranges with, the financial guys, right?
This whole thing is a big fruit salad problem, Ken. So don't worry about it. That's what we're here to do.
But so how do you deal with the equipment, facilities, leasehold improvements, that section?
Yeah, and that's an interesting piece, because it probably creates the most friction in evaluations with the owners, and is one of the largest misnomers. there is not, equipment, leasehold improvements, and facility. They're there in service of profitability. In and of themselves, they're not worth, their book value. So whatever you can sell them for an open market, but the highest and best use of equipment is right there in service of a profitable going concern. So when we value equipment, we want it to be a reasonably priced component, and it's never the main component. Somebody buying a business is not there to buy equipment. That's not, why they're entertaining the opportunity. Leasehold improvements, again, everything must be in working order. Everything must have a nice appearance. We can't have a leaking roof, but that doesn't mean that we need to replace the roof every 5 years. So if you're considering selling, the best way to really, before I get into that, the way to make your return on your investment on leasehold improvements and equipment is to operate those assets over time and generate profitability through them. So you will not get those dollars back dollar for dollar or even close at the time of sale. So if you're putting on a new roof, to me, you're expecting to stay there for quite some time. If you're doing an infrastructural remodel and redoing floors, cabinetry, walk-in drainage, you're expecting to stay there. So the close corollary that demonstrates this is bathrooms and kitchens in a residential home. Completely opposite things. You put in a bathroom or a kitchen in your house, and you will get that back for dollar, if not more, at the time of sale, because the purpose of a bathroom or a kitchen or a house is to be lived in, right? Residentially.
Right.
For a business, it's to generate profitability. And so if we're putting in money into infrastructural improvements, it's to generate profitability over time, and you will get a reasonable dollar amount for it. But in the context of some of these other things, out of 10, I'm going to put that at a 4 out of 10.
So there's a reason why people will, are operators, restaurant operators as an example, will maybe I'll say remodel their dining room 3 times before they remodel their kitchen.
Yes. Yeah. So
and that's part of, in the aspect of the sale, is that love for the business. What does it look like? What's not just the curb appeal from the outside, but also the inside, and also the aspect of when someone purchases the business, what's their view of what do they need to upgrade, right? And obviously the dining rooms can be, if they're very old, can glare very quickly that, I've got to go in and redo the whole entire dining room, as an example.
And if it impacts our curb appeal and the way and how people and customers patronize our business, then that does need to be upgraded. However, if we have a walk-in refrigerator and it can be fixed, let's say it's not a compressor issue, it can be fixed versus put in a new box, it will perform that same function that a new one will for the next 5 to 10 years. And however we value your equipment today, and then if we put a number on it, it will be worth roughly the same amount 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, if it's in working order. So it's important to know that, so you can continue operating it and you'll probably get the same amount. But the way to get those returns back from equipment is through time and operations, and not at the time of sale.
So I got a couple of other 2-3 other areas I want to cover. However, let me ask you that same question. If I'm a caterer, if I'm in catering, right, that might be a little bit different because the equipment is my business, right?
It is, and so that's going to tie into profitability again and return on investment. So, if we're pricing equipment a certain way, and let's say, and we're just talking round numbers, let's say again, back to that $150,000 a year, if that business is making $150,000 a year, but someone needs to buy, $750,000 worth of equipment in order to generate that $150,000, that becomes prohibitive. And it stops being attractive. So again, we're not buying equipment for its own sake. So even in the catering setting, it has to tie into, so our equipment is worth X. What is it actually achieving this X? So if it's, if our equipment is worth 750,000 and we're generating $100,000 in revenue, I can tell you that a buyer is not going to find that attractive from a return on investment standpoint. So the seller will very likely need to take a fairly steep loss if on the equipment, if they want to sell the business as a whole. Now, if it keeps sailing that way and it continues to be more and more asset heavy, then we're really looking at an equipment liquidation scenario, and it's no longer a viable going concern that can be sold altogether. So
Right.
So there is a way for that to get really prohibitive, where we can't even sell a business when there's too much equipment.
I've got a clarity here that someone's asking just briefly. So let me grab that real quick here. And it's on, so an owner's working the business, right?
Mhm.
So they are working the business on a daily basis and in a critical role other than driving the business, such as, cooking or sales or a floor manager. So would you add that to the net profit or remove that from the net profit, that owner's salary?
In a scenario where we're trying to come up with a revenue multiple, that would be subtracted. Owner's replacement costs. So who do we need to replace them with? If it's a general manager, and
Right.
let's say in King County right now, we need $50,000 to $60,000 to secure a general manager. Yeah, that would be subtracted.
Think about it. The way I think about it is, if I'm part of the daily operations, then you're going to have to, my salary is going to be included, or a fair equal. I mean, I might be paying myself 3 times more than what I would pay a manager for that role. But at the end of the day, what's the fair value to that, right, is important.
Yeah.
And if I'm in the business because I want to be there and I'm, helping out and I'm not critical, then at the end of the day, no, my salary does not, is removed out of the equation.
Yeah. No, I mean, the less, again, you are a bottleneck, the more replaceable you are, which is really counterintuitive. But we want to look at an owner and say, this guy, whether he's here, or this person, whether they're here or not, in a larger example, the day that Ray Kroc was no longer with us, nothing happened at the McDonald's drive-throughs any differently, right? It just kept, and that's kind of a highly scaled, larger example of it, but that's really for dollars at the time of sale, that is the most attractive sort of model, as to where the owner can choose their role, right? If you want to spend a day in the trenches and come and work Sunday brunch and see what's going on, great. But if you have to be there, or Sunday brunch doesn't happen, that's a different thing.
I think that's something important to look at as you're looking, again, 18 months, 2 years down the road, right? You're gonna sell, is, how are your people trained around you, and can they operate without you, so to speak, right? I shouldn't say so to speak, but I mean, do they need supervision, or are you in that critical position? So I'd go back to utilizing that word critical.
And by the way, that ties into the role, it ties into the role of ownership, right? So if we're saying your role is X, how quickly can that be upended? If you have everybody in place, but then the general manager leaves, and all of a sudden your contribution goes from 10 hours a day to 70 until you find a new one, that owner role is somewhat unstable. If you have 2-3 people behind there that you can promote, substitute, and sort of come up with a temporary solution until better solutions are implemented, then yeah, your role as an owner is more solidified, and you're not an employee necessarily in your own business. So
yeah, I think a lot of people forget that when they buy businesses, that I'm working a business, and what happens if I lose that key person, that chef, or
sure.
Right.
Yeah. So are you buying a business, or are you buying a job? And they're both models are successful, and buyers exist for both, but we need to be clear on what every specific opportunity represents. And when I'm saying that multiples can be complicated and then nuanced, that's the kind of stuff we're looking at really when we're doing evaluations.
Right. Okay, next, let's talk about location and market area.
Location, location, location. So, in a retail setting, it's a 9 to 10 out of 10. There's really not a mystery here. Back to the catering example, it depends. If you're catering, if 50% of your business is catering, then you do need a kitchen somewhere that we're starting to look at. More affordable rent becomes more important than your accessibility. But location for a retail restaurant, convenience, accessibility are important. You need to be in the area where your customers are. There needs to be parking, accessibility, or if it's walking, if it's retail walking, then how safe and accessible that area is. And an example where that kind of got upended here over the last little bit is downtown Seattle, for instance, right? Location, downtown Seattle represented something entirely different 24 months ago, perhaps, or pre-pandemic. So, buyers, customers, vendors are doing that location math when they see an address of an opportunity.
Okay. Yeah, that determines what actually the value is coming up, obviously, of location. So how about lease? So how important is lease and that lease value, 5, 10, 15 years, that ability to, I guess, short leases versus long leases left on the business?
Yeah, no, important question. And it ties again back into a couple of things that we already talked about: leasing versus owning, right? So if you're your own landlord, that lease represents something entirely different. If you're owning, you want to be paying fair market rent and fair market occupancy, but there isn't a danger where you're not going to renew your own lease, right? Or something comes up for redevelopment, and maybe you're surprised by a notice that the lease will not be renewed. A typical safe runway is 10 years for a business. So a five-year lease with a 5-year option is fairly standard. It's something that a lender will accept when we're financing opportunities, and at the time of sale, they'll want the business to have a brand new 5-year lease with a brand new 5-year option, because they want to make sure to protect their investment and that there's security in the occupancy, and the purchaser has a place to do business. So, as far as there's also a piece here that ties back to equipment and how I rate that, because a lease is often called, it's a lease asset, meaning it's in a good location. Well, if it's not generating profit, then it's really a lease liability, because you just have a rent payment and no money to come up with that payment, or struggling to come up with it. So a long-term, an 18-year lease in a place that's generally considered a good location, but the business, for whatever reason, isn't making a profit, there is no value to that. I mean, no one wants to contractually enter into a long-term lease when they're not expecting to make a profit. So again, it ties back to profitability. If you're in a fantastic location that that's in good shape, and by all indications things are going to continue going well, then the lease is important. And transferring the lease or reassigning the lease to a new buyer is part of IBA's representation services, and we regularly work with landlords to ensure that the new buyer that the successor has a favorable or similar lease as the departing seller. But it needs to be at market rates. It needs to be there needs to be security that you're signing up for a contract that will be beneficial financially. Because if you have a lease, again, in a great location, but the business isn't doing well, then it's not an asset, it's a liability. You just have a payment.
So is that borderline at 10 years? Is it at 7 years? If I've got a 7-year lease, should I be talking to my landlord about someone coming in, buying the business, of negotiating and adding another, 5 or 3? What should I be doing if I'm somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, so there's an order of operations here. You know, we don't want to be alerting the landlord to a sale of the business that may or may not happen, because that may sort of inform their future decisions on how they look at you as a tenant. Our goal in representation is to deliver a quality buyer, someone that we can introduce to the landlord, and that the landlord will be excited about as a hand-picked successor to this business. And so we need to introduce that at the right time. You know, lease assignment, reassignment is a common term, but the reality is that the new buyer will sign a brand new lease on terms similar is what we go for. So we want to give them a new 5-year lease and a 5-year option with possibly with you know, typical CPI increases or something tied to inflation, where you know, everybody feels like they're getting a reasonably good deal. You know, in inflationary times, it's going to be difficult to get a landlord to like a 10-year lease, because, you know, if 5 years from now inflation keeps sailing, they have a significantly underperforming asset on their hands, and with no ability to renegotiate. So those things are being, those metrics, those renegotiation parameters that are tied to inflation or consumer price index are now very frequently inserted into leases, especially at the option time. But 5 + 5, 10 years, those are good solid numbers. But as a seller, there is not really a point for you to go and secure a 10-year lease for yourself if you're exiting, because we'll need to assign it to a buyer. The buyer will need to sign a new lease.
So this, you know, so I got a good inning here with this. We'll talk about future earnings here, but just a quick second is,
Yeah.
you know, to me, I would think this is where the value of having a business broker, bringing qualified people to the table for a purchase, right? And then making sure I'm best prepared, right, to present myself as well, is kind of a key, because, you know, there's a lot of different things that are going on here. That lease being a part of it, you know, having the right buyer is important than just selling.
No, you know, if the buyer seller agree and the landlord doesn't, the deal doesn't happen.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about a real interesting one that that I think, you know, again, everyone can look at differently, but, you know, potential future earnings. My business is up out of COVID, right? Getting back to normal. I'm up, you know, double-digit figures. I mean, business has never been better, and I'm starting to think about selling. So do I sell now, or how can I focus on the aspect of the opportunity of my potential future? And maybe I asked too many questions there, but it's really
no, you're asking all the questions that sellers always ask. So I think it's echoing right now with our viewership, and I'm happy to answer it. So, you know, if we go to the profitability being number 1 and potential future profitability at number 10, I mean, those are good bookends, and they're a good way to start and end. So if the profitability has already, if the potential future earnings have already sort of happened, or we can demonstrate a trajectory, and let's say you came out of COVID and you're 30% up in 2021, better than you've ever done, then we can incorporate that into the evaluation model for, you know, for a business entering the market in 2022, provided that the performance continues, and the recent indicators support what we're saying. We don't want to push the narrative too far past what we can support with the numbers, and specifically with recent numbers. Part B, or case B, and this is a more difficult conversation, is really when the potential future earnings sort of exist, you know, hypothetically. And let's say we have plans to build a patio, and we have plans to add live music, and we have plans to bring on new menu items in the next 12 months, but we're selling now, and we're saying, you know, this is clearly going to increase numbers. The reality is we don't know if it's going to increase. And if we're saying that additional profits and earnings are fast at hand, the simple question on the buyer's behalf is, if it's that simple, why haven't you done it, right? And part B is, you know, go ahead and implement, and then let's see it on the numbers, and then we'll add it to the value. But the earnings, that it's quite simply potential future earnings, they just haven't happened yet, and that's the most difficult part about them. So we can't ascribe a large amount of value to earnings that we think will or will not happen. It's really up to us as the owner, if we think that they're going to happen, to stay at the helm, to manifest it, to bring it into being, show it on the financials, and incorporate it into the valuation. And there's no question, there's no hearsay, there's no hypotheticals. It's look at the last 12 months, look at the last 18 months, and here's what we project for the next 36. So that is an easier case to make than
Right.
it's certainly going to happen. It hasn't yet, but anyone can see that it will, right? That's a more difficult conversation.
Okay, so type your questions in. I'm going to start going through the Q&A period here. And thank you for those that have asked questions up to this point. So here's these are all going to be interesting, right? They're all current or recent events that are affecting, purchases and et cetera, and selling. Regarding inflation, is there anything you are guiding sellers on currently?
Yeah, a couple of things on inflation. One, we have to be mindful of how that affects. So inflation closely tied to interest rates. SBA loans, 7A program, very commonly used to fund hospitality business acquisitions, will not immune to raised interest rates. So it's going to be more expensive. SBA money has been extremely favorable as part of, federally incentivized government programs, but the cost of getting a loan will be more expensive, and it's not a deterrent, but it's a top of mind issue. As far as direct guidance, so inflation increases prices for labor and for cost of goods specifically. I would guide everybody to take a close look at what you're charging and see if price increases make sense. Our experience has been there's been very, very limited pushback. The general public, your client demographic, understands that the cost of running a hospitality business has increased tremendously. If you're putting forth a good product, I would guide you to build in price increases, because if you don't, left unaddressed, the 2022 numbers will likely be impacted negatively. You just won't see as much falling to the bottom line. And I think you'll be surprised by how much prices have gone up when you look at your year-end financials in 2022.
How is PPP being handled?
So restaurant revitalization funds, PPP, various rounds of PPP. So, they need to be addressed, and then they've gotten better, but they need to be closed out or forgiven or paid off at the time of sale by the seller. There's a couple of ways of handling it. Many of them have now been paid off by now. If they haven't been paid off and they're still in processing and waiting to be forgiven, those funds frequently are required to be put into escrow until forgiveness occurs, just so it's not a trailing liability for the buyer. Say that we take the money and then the government decides they don't want to forgive your loan. All of a sudden, the buyer is involved in that conversation. That money is escrowed until forgiveness is granted. But it has not been a deal stopper.
What if PPP is what made them profitable?
That is 100% hands down not a non-reoccurring revenue. That's not something that's going to be, if we're saying there's $200,000 of profit and 150 of it is PPP, making a case that that's going to continue is difficult. So that's clearly not going to be part of the business model moving forward. So that any grants, PPP loans, are income is adjusted for those expenses, and those are removed, or revenues rather, and those are removed.
So what happened before and what happens now is probably, I want to say in some aspects, more important.
What happens now, and then how that informs what happens in the future, because again, the future business is what, the purchaser is going to be thrilled that you've done great over the last 25 years and you got federal funds to help you through a difficult time. But the fact is, they're not any part of that. They want to know what the business that they're buying is going to do. So
Same for RPF, or excuse me, RRF loan.
RRF, yeah,
same
yeah.
thing.
So that one was great. It was lucrative for many business owners. I mean, I think it was tied to gross revenue, and you know, it should by all means be used to offset the losses that occurred as a result of a, you know, unique event. But they're not going to be added to profitability.
Right. All right. So is there, I love this one because this is really where we all want to get a better understanding. And sometimes, you know, the numbers are when you go through a webinar like this, on an independent, you know, restaurant versus a franchise model where they might have other franchisees, it's difficult to understand the value. But I think this is a really good question. Is there a formula you use, like annual profitability times the number of years left on a lease, plus equipment leasehold value, plus owner salary, owner labor, you know, what else? Is there, I mean, is this all going into a spreadsheet and to develop a formula? How do you do
I
it?
know. So it's really, there are multiple categories, you know, that we looked at, and all of those things play into it. I would caution anyone from trying to get a quick number, and I would advise that you set aside the time that's required to find out what your business is worth. You've been running it for, you know, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, maybe multiple generations. You've put in all this time. My recommendation would be to kind of temper your expectations and then give your exit the time and the attention that you've given your career, and then that it deserves. And so there's no quick way to determine exactly. If you get a ballpark number, I guarantee you, you're not going to want to get a ballpark account number, a ballpark amount of funds wired into your account. You're going to want to know what it is more or less exactly. So, you know, if you get a ballpark number, going to market, you know, it's throwing spaghetti against the wall. You may get it, you may not get any of it, you may get half of it, just because you haven't put in the work to really find out.
Okay, so I'm going to wind this up. Any other questions, let me know. What are the top three? Give me the top three most important things that you really, that are going to impact your business. What would you give out of that 10 we talked about? What are the top three?
Profitability, owner involvement and owner role in the business. Boy, it's hard. Curb appeal and quality of books and records. I'll put two in that last one.
Okay, well, profitability, right? Quality books and records. So we'll combine that together. All right.
Happy to answer any of those in more detail. Again, I don't want to cross any of them off of the list. The goal here was to really show the owners, you know, where to put their time if they are considering their exit strategy. So,
Oliver, I want to thank you. Shelby, behind the scenes, thank you very much for helping us out. Shelby will send an email out with the link in case anyone wants to see the recording. Also, Oliver's information in case you'd like to contact Oliver. This has been a big deal over the last couple of years, Oliver, and we thank you for being here, for sharing with our, you know, with our members, etc. You know, what's the important aspect of getting prepared for this. So we appreciate your time. Everybody's time is valuable here, but this is an important subject that we get a lot of interest and a lot of questions about. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be a resource to the hospitality business community. And if there are follow-up questions, please do use the information, my direct information, to get in touch, and we can continue to discuss details on any and all of these topics. I'm available.
Thank you. Take care. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.